Hello everyone, this week's parsha is Parsha Lech Lecha, which is very exciting. We're taking up the story of Avram, the forerunner of the Jewish people. Therefore, this is the beginning of our story. So we see God issues a command to Avram, Lech Lecha, says Rashi, Lehanatcha, L'tovatcha, right, for your benefit and for your good. And Avram takes Lot with him, and they set out excited, and Lot's very excited. There's promises of goodness to come, and then of course they get to Eretz Yisrael, and there's a famine, so that's not good. And then they have to go down to Egypt, and of course Sarai gets taken by Paro, which is difficult on Sarai for sure. It is difficult on Avram, seeing as his wife was just taken, but it's also hard on Lot, because Sarai is his sister. So it's also not so easy for him, and therefore we see this kind of this lessened enthusiasm in Lot. And we see that when we look at chapter 13, verse 5, also known as Shlishi. So says the pasuk, "V'gam Lot ha'olechet Avram ha'yatzonu bakar v'olim." Right. So Lot also had wealth. V'lo nasau tam haaretz lashevet yachtav, and land couldn't support them settling together. K'yar rechusham rav v'lo yachlu lashevet yachtav, because their property was great and they couldn't settle together. Well, okay. So it says pasuk Zayin, right, the 7th verse. V'hi ben roy miknei Avram uvein roy miknei Lot, and there's a dispute or an argument between the shepherds of Avram's sheep and the shepherds of Lot's sheep. V'aknani v'aprizi az yoshev haaretz, and the Canaanite and the Perizzite were dwelling in the land. Well, we should ask, well, what does one have to do with the other? Why is the pasuk telling us about this dispute between Avram and Lot, or rather Avram's shepherds and Lot's shepherds? Then we're getting this kind of parenthetical about how the Canaanite and the Perizzite are dwelling in the land. What does that have to do with the other? It's like, Reuven and Shimon were arguing, and the Native Americans were settling in the land. Okay, or like, the Jews were in Israel. Oh, okay, that's very nice. What does that have to do with the dispute? So it says Rashi on Vayiriv, Lefisha yu roav shalot r'shaim, because the shepherds of Lot were evil. Umarim behemtam besarot acherim, because they would pasture their animals in the fields of others, fields that didn't belong to them. Ve'roi Avram mochichim otam ala gezel, and so the shepherds of Avram were giving them tochacha, they were giving them rebuke over stealing. What are you doing? Feeding pasturing your animals here. They don't belong here. This isn't your land. So what's the response of Lot's shepherds? Fem omrim, so they respond, not na'aris la'Avram. Look, the land was given to Avram, v'lo in Yoresh, and he has no one to inherit him, v'lo Yorsho, and Lot's next in line, so he's going to inherit Avram. V'vein ze gezel, and so this isn't gezel, this isn't stealing. V'akatuv omer, so the pasuk says, v'aknani v'aprizi az yoshev v'aretz, the Canaanite and the Perizzite is dwelling in the land, v'lo zacha ba'Avram adayim, and Avram hasn't inherited yet, and therefore it is stealing. So there you go. That's why we have to connect the Canaanite and the Perizzite to this dispute of Avram's shepherds and Lot's shepherds, because that was the central point of their dispute. That is to say, does Avram own it or not? But there isn't only that problem with the raising of Lot's shepherds. There's actually something else. Because what is the whole basis that Lot's shepherds are raising their animals on other people's lands? Because the land was promised to Avram, and since Avram has no one to inherit him, Avram has no children, the person who's next in line is Lot. And therefore Lot is going to get the land, and therefore Lot's shepherds can pasture their animals anywhere in the land, even if it currently doesn't belong to them. But there's an issue here that Rav Bernstein points out. That is to say, the argument of Lot's shepherds is that the land is going to go to Avram, and since Avram has no descendants, it's going to come to Lot. But if we were to look at the full text of that promise to Avram, it said, God said to Avram, I'm going to give you the land to you and to your descendants. And therefore, implicit in this promise is the fact that Avram will have descendants. Avram will have children. And therefore, when Lot's shepherds say, look, the land was promised to Avram, but Avram doesn't have descendants, and therefore it's going to go to Lot. Well, they're kind of only paying attention to one part of the prophecy, and that may have been part of the argument between the shepherds of Avram and the shepherds of Lot. Because the shepherds of Avram would say, well, there's like a full prophecy here, and you need to see the full thing. That is to say, the prophecy says the land is going to go to Avram and his children, therefore implying that Avram will have children, and therefore Lot is totally out of the picture. Lot's shepherds are not bothered by this argument. They just ignore it. And from this we see a very important concept, a very disturbing concept, of looking at things very selectively. That is to say, Lot's shepherds know full well what the prophecy says, but they're not bothered by it, because it kind of gets in their way of the way they want to live things and the way they want to see the world. The fact is, yes, Avram is going to get the land, and yes, Avram currently doesn't have children, but part of the prophecy that gave Avram the land was the fact that Avram would have children. And therefore, Lot's shepherds coming in and seeing that prophecy and just kind of effectively surgically taking out the parts that they like and they want to believe in, saying, oh, this is our justification for feeding our animals in other people's lands and stealing. And even though they know full well what the full text of the prophecy is, shows a very disturbing element of reading Torah selectively and seeing things in a very selective manner. And I think that in itself is a very powerful message to take away. And Shabbat Shalom, and we'll see you next week.